How's everybody doing? Good. Good. That's all right then. Anybody got any questions on what we've done so far in this chapter before we do the last couple of slides? Anything about the cardiovascular system? Okay, so we were looking at changes that occur in the cardiovascular system when we're doing physical activity or exercise. We looked at the changes with regards to oxygen delivery, and now we're going to look at the redistribution of blood flow. Okay, so I really like this diagram. I think it's a good visual. The top half is blood flow during heavy exercise. The bottom half is at rest. All right, so we can see that our skeletal muscles at rest have about 15 to 20% of the cardiac output, so Q, is going to the muscles. Remember, at rest, Q is somewhere around 5 liters per minute, right? And then we have, so 15 to 20% of 5 liters going to our skeletal muscles. When we're exercising heavily, Q can be as high as 25. For some really advanced endurance people, maybe even 30, so 25 liters per minute, and now we've got 70 to 85, right? So 85% of our blood flow of Q is now going to the skeletal muscle. So that gives you a good idea of the change in blood flow to the muscles when we're exercising, and that change then results in a large amount of oxygen and nutrients being available to the muscle tissue to make ATP. All right. So how do we do that? Right? How do we make this enormous change? We have to be able to redirect blood flow from areas where it's not essential at that point in time to the muscles. All right, and we do that by using sympathetic input to the arteries to help them dilate towards the areas we want to direct the blood flow to the muscles, and constrict to areas we don't need blood flow if we're moving around. So the kidneys, the stomach, right? So it's very important that we do not have a lot of heavy food in our stomachs when we start to exercise, because that blood flow is going to get moved away towards the muscle, and that food is just going to sit there undigested, right? So you can see here the stomach and the intestines, the digestive system, get about 1/4 of the blood flow when we're at rest. But when we're exercising, they only get about 5%, right? So less. One of the interesting ones is when you look at the brain, we get 15% of 5 liters at rest, and only 3 to 4% of 25 liters when we're exercising. So if we don't consider the numbers, if we don't do the math there, it looks like we have this big decrease in blood flow to the brain. But actually, the brain can't tolerate a decrease in blood flow because then you would pass out, right? You'd faint. So you have to do the math to see that 15% of 5 is about the same as 3 to 4% of 25, all right? So we can't increase blood flow to the brain because the brain tissue is too soft, too delicate, and increasing blood flow to an area that can't expand would put too much pressure onto that delicate brain tissue, right? So we only see a teeny tiny change, little bit of increase in blood flow to the brain, right? The stomach, you can see, oh no, not the stomach, the heart gets 4 to 5% of 5 liters at rest, and then 4 to 5% of 25 liters when we're exercising, all right? Because the myocardium needs massive additional blood flow and oxygen to be contracting that much faster to get the blood flow, right? You know how much faster your heart beats when you're exercising. That faster heartbeat requires more oxygen and more glucose so that the heart muscle can keep contracting that quickly, right? So the increase in Q allows for about 5 times the amount of myocardial blood flow, okay? And then a really interesting idea is the fact that the veins have acted like this big reservoir, right? So if we consider the fact that we go from 5 liters per minute to 25 liters per minute cardiac output, right? Where did that other 20 liters suddenly come from? It's not like we just made 20 liters extra of blood. We had to have it already in the system somewhere. And a lot of it is sitting in the veins. They act like reservoirs. They're quite stretchy, and so the blood will pool into the veins, all right? And so then when we exercise, there has to be a mechanism in place to move that blood flow back to the heart to increase cardiac output, all right? So what we see occur is we get venoconstriction. So vasoconstriction on the previous slide was constriction of the arteries to impact blood flow direction, right? Venoconstriction is also under sympathetic stimulation, and now we're constricting the veins, right? Not in the skeletal muscle, but everywhere else in the body, right? In inactive areas of the body when we're exercising, right? So blood pressure is quite low in the veins compared to the aortic arch and the arteries, all right? And so we have to do something more than just let it flow back, it's too slow, right? So we constrict the veins, and that increases the flow from the vein up towards the heart, right? So at rest, the veins have about 65% of our total blood volume sitting in those veins, right? The other thing we see that helps with venous return, right? We've got to get more blood back to the right aorta so that it can go and collect oxygen, right? We have these muscle pumps in large muscles. So there's a really nice diagram in the book of the gastrocnemius muscles. And what happens here is within the vein that the muscle is kind of around, there's a valve. And so when the muscle is contracting with exercise, it propels blood up through the valve, and the valve is a one-way valve. So once the muscle has squeezed and the blood has been pushed through the valve on up towards the heart, it can't come back, right? So some of that reservoir then starts to get pumped through this muscle pump towards the heart, right? One of the reasons, if you take long distance flights, so they, most airlines now will play a little video at the beginning when you're sitting there waiting to take off. They'll play a little video and say, here are some exercises you can do to keep your blood flowing and to stay healthy while you're on the flight, for example. You don't see them on short-haul flights internally, but if you do international flights, I think pretty much all of them do it now. And one of the things they tell you to do, other than get up and walk around quite often, is when you're sitting in your chair to be moving your feet, lifting your heels up and down, lifting your knees up and down, because they're trying to improve blood flow back to the heart and to prevent clots and things occurring. Quite a long time ago now, in my lifetime, but it's a long time ago. When I first started flying internationally, there weren't really any restrictions on movement around the cabin, right? You could do anything. And then they went through a phase of saying, no, you cannot move around the cabin, you have to stay in your seat for the whole flight. Well, what happened was that on some really long-haul flights, like down to Australia and New Zealand, a couple of people ended up dying because they had a blood clot develop that then when they got off the plane traveled around their body and gave them a heart attack or a stroke. So now we're back to, no, it's really important to keep exercising, you know, you want as little swelling in your feet as you can manage, so get up and go back to the toilet or stand up and, you know, move around, do some stretching. And so they're very supportive of that now on the planes. There's also a respiratory pump, which will make a little bit more sense as we get into chapter 7, because the changes in pressure that occur within the thoracic cavity also act as a kind of pump to move blood back towards the heart from the lungs. Okay, so, and that's the respiratory pump, again, is enhanced when we exercise because we breathe harder, right? So we are looking at adaptation being positive, remember, right? And in the cardiovascular system, we're seeing adaptations mostly to aerobic work for these factors, for these variables. If the graphs help you, right, there's a graph for each variable in the chapter. So this one is for VO2, all right, So the untrained person is green, the trained person is orange. They have a lower intensity for their heart rate of work, and they can work harder after training, right? If you like, as I said, if you like graphs and the graphs are helpful, use the graphs. If you don't like graphs, don't use them. All right, I think they're quite helpful. Again, the orange is the train. This is for stroke volume, right? And here's my stroke volume for an untrained person. So we know that we see increases in stroke volume with training, because then we see decreases in heart rate with training, right? Cardiac output. The biggest change is that someone who's trained can go for longer, has more availability of cardiac output at high intensity. Blood pressure, and this one is VO2. Right? So the graphs won't be on the exam, but for some of you the graphs might help you understand this idea of adaptation. All right? Adaptation is positive. The body is going to change in response to stress in a way that allows us to manage that stress more effectively. Right? So exercise is the stress. How do we adapt to that physiologically? Okay? Questions? That's the end of chapter 6. Dun, dun, dun. Questions? No questions? So, I've been looking through chapter 7, and it has some additional information that I thought might be interesting to try to cover. I've got to take a better look at it over spring break, because technically we only have this class today and one class after spring break on chapter 7, and then we've got exam number 3 on those 2 chapters. If I want to cover more material, I might have to do some jiggery-pokery with the timetable so that we can have a third lecture on the information from chapter 7. So I'll play with that over spring break, and I will put out an announcement if I change the timetable at all, okay?
Dr. Wood,
Yes.
are you going to be in the office hours later?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. 3:15. Yes. Okay. So the next piece of the pie, all right, we've looked at how do we make energy. We've looked at how do we get the signal to the muscle to contract. We've looked at how the muscle contracts. We've looked at how we get oxygen and nutrients to the muscle. Now we're going to look at how do we get oxygen into the system to be transported to the muscle. All right? So what happens with the respiratory system with exercise? Okay? And there's a couple of things that are new. One thing that's new is that there's a piece on the difference in the lungs between males and females, which I haven't seen before, which I thought was quite interesting. They've also added some information on bronchospasm and exercise-induced asthma, and some training for the respiratory muscles. So I think that might be quite interesting information. It's very applied. I like the applied stuff because that's more realistic for us than all the chemistry type information. So I'm going to take a closer, as I said, take a closer look at that over spring break and see. I'll either adapt the lecture a little bit for after spring break, or I'll try to add a third lecture in and jiggle things around slightly. So as always, I'm not going to cover very much of the anatomy of the respiratory system. That should have been covered in A&P. This ought to be looking somewhat familiar to you. And if you're a bit rusty on your anatomy of the lungs, please go and do a little bit of review. All right, the area we're the most interested in is what's going on at the alveoli. All right, because very little gas transfer occurs anywhere else except at the alveoli. There's a little bit in the bronchioles leading in, but almost all the gas transfer is occurring in these alveoli. So the functions of the system: get air in and out of the lungs, because the air has the gases that we need to absorb and to get rid of. All right, so we've got a mechanism for gas exchange across the membranes in the lungs. It also adds some moisture to the air because the lung tissue, kind of like brain tissue, is very, very delicate. And if it dried out, then it wouldn't be able to perform the gas exchange, right? So we have to keep it damp. We want to warm the air up a little bit so that the temperature of the lungs and the surface for the gas exchange don't get too cold. All right? And it also acts as a filter for a lot of pathogens, not pathogens, dust and particles that are in the air. Not all of them, because if it filtered all of them, we wouldn't have allergies, right? So it doesn't work 100%, but it does a really good job, okay? So especially if you breathe through your nose, you've got little cilia, little hairs in your nose that can move mucus towards your oral cavity. We can then kind of cough it out if we need to. Anything that isn't caught by the mucus in the system can be engulfed by macrophages and eaten up and got rid of that way. It's very important when we're in low humidity environments, cold environments, because the water vapor evaporates much faster in those situations. So in New Mexico we get a double whammy, right, because it's very dry and it can be very cold, right? So I don't know if you've seen them or if you've had to use them, but like those saline nasal sprays can be very useful to help keep things warm and humid in the system, or wearing a mask across in this day and age. But really, you know, putting a scarf across your face if you're out for a walk or something like that, so that the scarf gets a bit damp, and then that can help keep the membranes moist so that they don't dry out. All right, so let's talk about our alveoli, because that's really, as I said, that's what we're the most interested in. So the alveoli are like those little bundles of grapes, those little round sacs, and they're attached to the bronchioles, so there's a little bit of gas exchange in the bronchioles, but very, very little. Almost all of the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide occurs via the surface of the alveoli. Nitrogen, we know we have nitrogen in the air, but we don't use nitrogen. Humans don't use it, so we can ignore nitrogen as part of the atmosphere for our purposes, right? On average, they reckon that there's about 300 million alveoli in an individual's lungs. So how they get that number, I'm not entirely sure, but that's what they average it at, right? So you can imagine, right, 300 million of these little balls. Imagine a golf ball, right? And imagine 300 million golf balls, and then think about how that changes the surface area that is available for gas exchange, right? If we just had the lungs as a flat surface, we'd have nowhere near the amount of area that we do, because it's made up of these little balls, all right? So give me a guess. What do you think if we laid out all the alveoli in our lungs flat on the ground? What do you think would be the size of that surface area? What do you think that surface area is equivalent to?
Could we compare that to something that, like, I don't know, is very generalized, like the size of an average backyard, maybe?
Yeah, no, that's perfect, right? It's about the size of a tennis court, right? So imagine a pair of lungs, like here's George's lungs. I'm just going to steal your lungs, George. Right? So here's my lungs, okay? Now, think about if this was just a flat surface. There's not much area there, right? So by having those little balls, we turn this surface area into a tennis court. Pretty amazing, right? So that allows for much more gas exchange than we could otherwise do. It's a little bit like the, not that we cover that in this class, but it's a little bit like the convolutions that you see in the brain. You know, if you look at a brain, it's not just one round, smooth thing. It's all these kind of wiggly lines and convolutions and deep caverns, and right, because by evolving like that, it's increased the surface area for chemical and blood exchange. Right? And then we have what we call the respiratory membrane. So the respiratory membrane is made up of the membrane of the alveolar and the membrane of the capillary that's running next to it. Okay, so here's one alveolus, okay, and here's the artery then the artery turns into a capillary network, and then it kind of forges into the vein, and the blood goes off back to the heart. Right? So from the arteries coming from the right side of the heart needs oxygen, the blood that's in there, wraps around the alveoli, picks up oxygen, goes off back to the left side of the heart. Right? So if we take a cross section through that, you can see that the alveolus is absolutely surrounded, mapped around with this capillary netting. Okay? And then this diagram here, so this is a red blood cell. So if you can see this really clearly in the diagram in the book. Here's the wall of the capillary, right? And then the kind of pinky purple is the wall of the alveolar. And so this distance here is the respiratory membrane. So what we're looking for is oxygen to move from the alveolus into the bloodstream onto the red blood cell. And the red blood cell is going to give up its carbon dioxide, and it's going to cross over into the lungs, and we're going to breathe that out. Right? So remember back to biology in high school, or probably even middle school, right? We breathe out carbon dioxide, the trees and the plants breathe in carbon dioxide and breathe out oxygen. We breathe in oxygen, breathe out carbon dioxide. It's a very symbiotic relationship, and we need to take better care of it because we are trashing the forests, right? And sooner or later, that is going to kick us in the butt because we all depend on each other, right? Okay, so remember our law, right? Things move from an area of high pressure or high density to an area of low pressure or low density, all right? That's important to have a picture of in your mind right now, okay? So the way that we breathe is very dependent upon that physics law, right? So when we breathe in, right, what's happening is we use our respiratory muscles to change the volume in the thoracic cavity, right? So we increase the volume by pulling our ribs out, and our lungs are kind of stuck to the inside of the ribs and the diaphragm. So as those all move, the lungs expand. As the lungs expand, the pressure inside the lungs drops to lower than the pressure outside in the atmosphere, and air rushes in through nose or mouth. Right? So that's inspiration, breathing in. Okay? So the diaphragm's really important in that role. So I expect when we get to the new information about the training of the respiratory muscles, we're going to see some suggested exercise for training the diaphragm. Okay? So it contracts, and by contracting, pulls the lungs down, expands the lungs, and we see air rush in. Right? Then in order to breathe out, we don't have to contract any muscles to breathe out. We just have to stop contracting and allow them to relax, to return back to a relaxed state. And as they relax, it decreases the lung volume, which increases the pressure, and air moves out into the atmosphere. Right? So there's this, it's like the diaphragm has some recoil to it, right? It contracts, and then it stops contracting and it passively recoils. And as it recoils, it makes the lungs smaller, pressure increases, air moves out. So, let's do a little start here. All right, so it's important to remember that fluid, gas, goes from high to low. The high can be pressure, the high can be concentration, right? So, if my intrapulmonary pressure is greater than the atmosphere outside, oops, right? This is high, this is low. Air is going to move that way, right? So that's breathing out. If my intrapulmonary pressure is less than the pressure of the atmosphere, right? Now, the atmosphere is high and the inside is low, and I breathe in. Okay? So when we're talking about that high-low, I know I said this before, but it's important. It's the relative picture, not an absolute picture, right? That because it changes. So you have to think about, in relation to what am I looking at high and low? Okay? So during inspiration and expiration, breathing in and breathing out, the pressure gradients are created by changing the volume of the lungs and the thoracic cavity. Right? Lung tissue has no contractile element in it at all. Lungs cannot contract and relax. Okay? So that's important to understand. The lungs aren't doing anything, right? They are just responding to being dragged around because they're stuck to the diaphragm and the rib cage. Questions? No? Makes sense?
Yes.
Yeah. Because you have to be careful. Again, the language is important here, right? Because the language is what sets you apart from someone who doesn't know what they're talking about. Right? So when you go for an interview, it's important that you can use the correct language, the correct terminology, to answer questions, because that shows you know what you're saying. People who say, oh, I train my lungs really hard and they're getting much stronger, are talking a load of twaddle, because you can't train your lungs. They don't do anything, right? So it's very important to use the right language at the right time. I'm not training my lungs, I'm training the respiratory muscles, right? I'm not training lung tissue. Okay? So, airflow and resistance to airflow. Exactly the same principle as we had in the previous chapter with blood flow and resistance to blood flow. We're just going to use a different set of capital letters here and different terms, but it's exactly the same principle. All right? So airflow is the pressure difference divided by the resistance to airflow, right? So remember, so the change in pressure over the resistance, right? So airflow can be increased just as we could increase blood flow by expanding the diameter of the artery. We can increase airflow by expanding the pressure difference between two areas, right? So can I expand the diameter of the airway or constrict the diameter of the airway, right? If I decrease the resistance to airflow by expanding the diameter, then that's going to improve airflow in. So one of the things that happens when you are out doing a walk or a bike ride or a run, and you might not have noticed it, so pay attention to it the next time you go, all right? One of the things that the body will do is you might go out and start by breathing through your nose because you know you have allergies, and you know that if you breathe through your nose, that should help a little bit with your allergies, right? So you go and you're breathing through your nose, and after a while, all of a sudden you realize you're breathing through your mouth, right? Try to go back to breathing through your nose. It's actually quite difficult because what the brain is trying to do, obviously the airway through the mouth is much bigger than the airway through the nose. So by switching from the nose to the mouth, the brain is trying to decrease the resistance to airflow and get more airflow into the lungs. Right? So it is actually, once you've realized that you've switched, even if you try consciously to go back to your nose, it feels very uncomfortable. Right? So give it a go the next time that you're there, out and about. You might have read about using those nasal strips, right, to try and pull the nasal cavity wider to increase airflow. There's no research that supports the use of those. They don't give you any advantage according to the research, unless it's a psychological advantage because you think you're doing something to help yourself, right? But actually, physiologically, they're not doing anything at all, okay? If we've got some kind of restrictive disease or symptoms. So if you have asthma, if you're a smoker, if you have COPD, if you've got bronchitis, right, any of these narrows the airways into the lungs and makes it harder for airflow to go through, right? They add the resistance in the same way that when we looked at the artery, the plaque buildup on the inside of the artery wall narrowed what was left of the opening for the blood flow. If we have any of those issues going on, then it's harder, it narrows the airway, right? So it increases the resistance to airflow by narrowing the airway. When we exercise, then the nervous stimulation is aimed at bronchodilation. So it's trying to open up those airways to decrease the resistance to airflow. Right? So it's difficult if you have asthma, for example, because if you can exercise in a way that doesn't trigger your asthma, it will cause bronchodilation and should help breathing for a little bit during exercise, right? Because the problem is if you've got constriction because of the asthma going on, then it takes more energy to push more air through the restriction, right? So you get tired a bit more quickly. So pulmonary ventilation is kind of the fancy term for breathing. And the tidal volume is equivalent to the stroke volume. So the stroke volume was the amount of blood squished out per beat, right? The tidal volume is the amount of air moved per breath. So they're the equivalent in two different systems. Okay? And the volume, VE, is the volume of air expired per minute. It's equivalent to Q, the amount of blood moved per minute. Right? So, VE is VT, tidal volume, times frequency. Okay? So let's have a look at the relationship here so that you realize you're not having to learn two different things, right? This is an important kind of thing I think to pay attention to here. A lot of these are similar, which means if you've learned them for the cardiovascular system, you don't now have to relearn them for the respiratory system because it's the same principle, right? So, Q equals heart rate times stroke volume. No, let me put it the other way around so it matches the one on there. Stroke volume times heart rate. Okay. VE equals VT times frequency. So how much air is moved per minute is equal to how much air is moved per breath times how many breaths I take per minute. Right? It's exactly the same thing. Oops, and I ran out of time. Okay, so we will pick up and finish that information. I will have a look at the chapter and either play with the lecture notes so that I can fit it all in the first lecture. Where are we now? What day is today? Wednesday?
Yes,
Ooh,
ma'am.
maybe I did plan for 3. Because we've got Friday. I'll look at the syllabus. I think we need 3 for this chapter, but I will look at the syllabus and see, and I'll let you know. I'm really interested in looking at that new information. And the only way I get to look at it is if I make myself include it in the lecture. So, okay, any questions on any of that we've done today? It's really interesting how the body has evolved and the changes that we see from rest to exercise, I think. It's very fun. It doesn't matter which system you look at, it's absolutely fascinating what it's capable of doing to make exercise possible for us. So, okay. So today is Wednesday, huh? Okay, that means we have lab tomorrow. So I will see you tomorrow at 11. And I don't remember what we're looking at. We'll work that out in the morning. Yeah, good. Be thinking, please, if you have not been staying on top of your labs, right? Think about getting those caught up for midterm, okay? So that you don't have piles of labs to do in the second half of the semester. That would not be a good strategy, okay? All right. I'll see you tomorrow. Have a good afternoon.